So now from photographs, we move on to opium trade, the India-China connection. And for that, I would like to request Dr. Madhavi Thampi, Professor Amar Farooqui, and Professor Chinmay Tumbe on stage. Before we begin the session, may I request Professor Rakesh Basant to please present Madhavi Thampi with a story. Over to you, Chinmay.
Thanks a lot, Disha. We're going to be talking about a very interesting product category called opium, which maybe most of us have never consumed in our lives. It's a commodity which is so remarkable in history because it was such a big part of the India-China trade. And we have, I would say, literally the two leading experts on this right now with us on stage. Professor Madhavi Thampi has worked all her life on China. She's one of India's foremost scholars on China, written many books. She was a former professor at Delhi University, associated with the Institute of Chinese Studies. And from the context of this panel, called China and the Making of Bombay. So that's the context in which she's going to be speaking. Professor Amar Farooqui, also from Delhi University, so we have two panelists from Delhi University, has also written widely on multiple fields, especially princely states, urban history, opium, and of course, in this world, written two books on opium, Smuggling as Subversion and The Opium City. And The Opium City is about Bombay. Bombay also happens to be a city I come from, so we're going to have two Delhi people speaking about my city. So I'm very intrigued to know what they're going to tell me about Bombay, and in particular, this particular interesting product called opium. Let's start the slide. So if you've never seen what an opium factory looked like, this is quite a dramatic kind of representation of that. It's a picture from the 1850s. The story of the opium trade really begins much earlier on, but what you see out here is truly vast scale. Just the sheer scale of operation should be staggering, right? This is a picture a painting done in Patna in the 1850s, a series of paintings. And we're going to use this picture as a backdrop, as a very dramatic backdrop while we speak for the next 10 or 15 minutes. And we're going to shift between the speakers and take us through this chronology. This is a story from roughly the 1750s to the late 19th century and how India and China get involved in this particular trade. So I'll start by asking Professor Amar Farooqui a very simple question to begin. What is opium?
Yeah, before I say something about opium, and I speak as a historian, I'm not, I don't have a science background, so I don't talk of it as a chemist would talk about opium. I just want to say something about the opium chests, which is the title of this talk. Opening the opium chest. Now, opening an opium chest was opening a chest that was full of very deadly poison. But this chest that we are referring to is the way in which opium was sold in wholesale during the 18th, 19th century, mainly for the China market. The opium chests usually contained about 80 kilograms of opium. Actually, it was less than that because there was also a lot of sort of dried stalks and so on to hold the to pack the opium tightly. Opening an opium chest would mean that there would be 40 balls of opium. What these people are carrying are really balls of opium, each ball weighing 1.5 kilograms of opium. So 20 balls at the top, and then a straw mat, and then another 20 balls, and the rest of the weight comes from the dried stalks and trash, which was packed along with the opium. Now we need to remember, when we talk about these balls of 1.5 kilogram, that opium is consumed, or rather was consumed, in minuscule quantities. Fractions of the tola, something like 2 or 3 mustard seeds. So each chest contains a huge amount of opium in terms of the amount of opium that can be consumed, and which is then they should give you an idea of the number of opium consumers. At the end of the 19th century, opium, according to official figures in China, coming from different parts of India, was roughly 90,000 chests. So that should give you an idea of the scale of, and Professor Thampi would, of course, be able to tell us more about this, that to this we need to add the opium that was already being cultivated, grown and produced in China in very, very large quantities, So the opium is the extract of the poppy plant, the opium poppy. There's only one poppy plant, Papaver somniferum, which produces opium. It is a kind of thickish, semi-solid latex-like substance, which is the yield of the bulb of the opium poppy, and collecting that opium is it's sort of so labor intensive. So this is very, very labor intensive. What you see over here is actually something that's the semi-finished product. But before this, there is already an enormous amount of work that has gone into the cultivation of the opium poppies, which is also very labor intensive, and then the collection of the opium, because the opium bulb has to be, an incision has to be made, it has to be then left to slightly thicken, collected in the next morning, so something that goes on over several days. Once it is collected, it is put into pots, and it is then dried. So again, over here, what happened in the opium factory, which was the factory of the East India Company, so it's a company establishment, it's a state maintained establishment, processed in state controlled, state-maintained processing centers, so this opium is then sort of brought to these factories, where for a long time it has to be then dried. So it takes several months for it to lose its moisture before it acquires the consistency with which it can then be packed in these chests and shipped off to China.
Thanks so much. And before I go to Professor Madhavi, just one last quick point on why was it made? I mean, what were people doing with it?
Yeah, I think it's necessary when we talk about opium to differentiate between opium for medicinal use. Opium, opium is a kind of chemical powerhouse. It contains a large number of chemicals, of which the most important chemical is morphine, which is, you would know, is a very powerful painkiller. So even today, morphine remains in short supply. It's a very, very powerful painkiller. But apart from that, opium is used for, it has other medicinal uses. For instance, it's a cough suppressant. It was in the latter half of the 19th century, it was assumed that it was also a cure for malaria. So there was a particular chemical extracted from it called noscapine, which was supposed to be a cure for malaria. So it has its medicinal uses. Of course, as I said, morphine remains the most important chemical that opium contains. But this is not for medicinal use. We should be very clear that this is opium intended for use as a narcotic, as a mood-altering substance, as a powerful mood-altering substance. And this is something that today, and since the First World War, is criminalized. So this is the opium that is sold in China is for as a narcotic substance.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, we have a movie in India called Urta Punjab. Some of you might have heard of it, on the drug. And what we're essentially talking about is Urta China in this particular time period. And on that note, Professor Madhavi Thampi, give us a bit of a context of what's happening in the India-China trade overall. We'll get into the opium trade, but you're a scholar in China. Before the 19th century, how is India and China linked in different ways? Are there Indians living in China in the 18th century? Are there Chinese living in India? What are the kind of products that are being traded? If you can set a bit of a context of India-China linkages before the 19th century.
Yes, thank you. The opium trade has so much dominated the discussion of India-China trade in the modern period. I mean, definitely India was the source of this huge trade in a drug that had huge repercussions for China. So that it's important to sort of put it in its context of the larger, commercial relationship between India and China. These were the two major producing regions of Asia, of this part of the world. And they have been trading from, we have actual evidence from about the 1st century BC. It could be even earlier. And I think one thing which is very interesting about the India-China trading relationship is that, one, it has continued. It has always, it's been there in various forms. And it has been both a land-based trade and a maritime trade. So this is not so common in that era, in this era. But in India-China case, there was the trans-Himalayan trade, or the trade through Central Asia, or as well as the trade through Southeast Asia and the maritime trade. And this has sort of changed over a period of time. I would say till about the 8th century CE, the land-based trade was more important, and it was very instrumental in the transmission of Buddhism also from India to China, and not just directly from India to China, but through Central Asia and into. So the land-based trade was important, very important till about the 8th century. Then for various reasons, one of which was disturbances, changes in the political climate in Central Asia. The other was the advance of maritime technology. Particularly, the Chinese were really pioneers in nautical technology. And in what we call, using Chinese historical terms, the Sung period, which is really 12th to 14th centuries, the Chinese really developed the nautical technology so that they actually dominated the sea routes from China, through the Indian Ocean and all the way up to the coast of East Africa. So this has been, so when we have to see this 19th century opium trade in this context, that there's always been. And, we tend to nowadays look at things, very bilaterally. India, China, and, we're only interested in what is India, China. But if you really look at the history of interactions between India, China, and not just the commercial interactions, cultural, you have to take into account that the whole of Central Asia as well as the whole of Southeast Asia. And that the values, whether they're material values, cultural values that they went in both directions, but that they weren't, point to point. They went through these other areas, they were transformed in these areas and then moved. So I think, we have to sort of see that. Now, Indians, we know about the presence of Indians during the 8th century in CE, in China, what's called Tang Dynasty China, which was a very cosmopolitan era in Chinese history. And in fact, the city of Canton, which is today's Guangzhou, was known for having, huge quarters full of foreign traders, among whom were traders from South Asia. So we have Indian traders there. Then, we have a period when Indian traders also sailed to China and landed in places on the coast like what is called Quanzhou, the port of Quanzhou, or like central South China, and as well as Guangzhou and other places. And we even have evidence of, Shaivite temples in Quanzhou. They're the remains of, so these were built by Tamil merchants actually, who went that way. So, but there was definitely a period when the Chinese dominated the seas, you could say, and they moved in this direction. And I don't know how many of you have heard of the famous Chinese admiral called Zheng He in the 16th century, early 16th century, who led huge armadas, the like of which were not seen after that for many centuries, all the way up to East Africa. But India was a major stop, and particularly the ports of Cochin and Calicut. These were, major ports, as well as, of course, Sri Lanka, Malacca, and other places. So this is what I would say is the larger picture within which you have to see the China.
And in the 18th century, before we get to opium, what are some of the products which are going from India to China, and what is coming from China to India?
You mean before opium?
Before opium.
So
around the same time, yeah.
Yeah. So of course, silk was a major product from China to India, and it's, I don't, in my language we say China patta for silk. So, this is, there are many words which have China in front of them, by the way, or chini even. Chini itself, because, the sugar cane production and then the refining of sugar, the technology, this is all. So, sugar, silk, gold, then camphor, things like this were, and then tea, of course. So, chai, the word chai, the Chinese word is cha. I mean, the northern Mandarin word is cha. But tea, the word tea comes from is closer to the Cantonese pronunciation, which is South China pronunciation. So tea was, of course, also one of the, and brick tea used to be sent from Sichuan, Tibet into northern India also. So these were some of the products.
Very, very interesting. Can we have the next slide, please, from the deck? Yeah, this is just again, the reflection from the factory. This is again a picture from 1850s, so not really the time period we're talking about, late 18th, 19th century. And the next slide, please. Yeah. So we talk a bit with this picture now, again from the 1850s, but it gives you a sense of the opium trade. The opium is produced in a factory, it is being transported, and it reaches the waters. Yeah. Can we go one slide back?
Yeah, that's the opium chest, and you can see the East India Company's stamp. So that gave it its great brand value. It's the East India Company's stamp, which was always the most important part of it. It guaranteed the purity of the opium.
Yeah, and I should also mention the East India Company, since you mentioned the word brand. The East India Company brand today is owned by an Indian guy. You know, he revived the brand and he actually owns it. So that particular emblem still exists in the market today, even though the East India Company is no longer there. Yeah, next slide, please. So the trade begins, and this is a picture of the opium clippers on the Ganga. Right? So a narcotic becomes a huge traffic point on a holy river in this particular time period. And we're talking of a particular part of India, Eastern India, but that's actually not our main story. Our main story is going to be Western India. So Professor Farooqui, just take us very briefly through what's happening in Eastern India, Patna, Calcutta, and how does this opium trade really begin? And then we'll move to Western India.
Yeah, very quickly, because what you see over here is the beginning of a journey which will eventually end in China and Canton, of course. And I prefer still I'll use Canton because that's the period we are talking of is Canton. So, but there are, quickly let me just say this, that opium, there are two major opium producing zones in India, in the Indian subcontinent. One in Eastern India, which were Bihar and parts of eastern and to some extent central, what is today central Uttar Pradesh. Those were the opium. That was an opium-producing zone, and the second was the central Indian plateau of Malwa, which was a major opium-producing zone. So these are two major opium-producing zones. The East India Company's control was confined to Eastern Indian opium. And again, talking of brand names, in the wholesale market, this was known as Bengal opium. So Bengal opium actually meant company opium. But most of it came from either Bihar or from eastern Uttar Pradesh. When the East India Company established its control in 1757, it took over the entire trade in opium. There's a long history to that, but within 4 decades of the Battle of Plassey, it had established a complete monopoly over the over Eastern Indian opium. Prior to that, the Dutch East India Company had been trading in opium sourced from Bihar. And in fact, in a sense, it is really the Dutch East India Company which was the pioneer of this trade. So this drug trade initially starts with the Dutch, who in fact carry it not to China but to Java for distribution in the Indonesian archipelago. And by about the 1640s, 1650s, they are sort of sending something like 500 pounds of opium. Again, we need to remember that opium is consumed in minuscule quantities. So 500 for that time, for a society which is not accustomed to this narcotic and has no social sort of control over it. Therefore, systems of control. For them also, this is an entirely new mood-altering substance. So by the end of the 17th century, this trade is well established. The Dutch East India Company is able to source quantities of opium from Bihar, and some of this might have made its way to China as well. But for the Dutch, Indonesia was the main market. What the British take over after 1757 is the system that operated under the Dutch, which means procuring it from contractors who then procured it from peasants. But what the East India Company did was, the English East India Company, the difference was it took over this trade entirely, which meant it established a complete monopoly of right from production of the opium to processing of opium, something with the Dutch East India Company did do, and then of course the sale of opium to merchants in Calcutta, where it was auctioned. Peasants could cultivate the opium only on obtaining a license from the East India Company. The license specified the amount of opium, the land that could be cultivated, the area that could be sown, the amount of opium that had to be produced, which was then to be delivered to the company in its semi-liquid form. So the entire process was controlled by the East India Company, and this trip is sort of the almost the fag end of that entire production process. What is going to happen now is that this opium will be taken to Calcutta, where it will be auctioned to private traders, and this is the interesting part of the story. It will be auctioned to private traders, who will then smuggle the opium into. So the company didn't take the risk of smuggling it into China. The opium was smuggled by private traders, so they auctioned it off, and then it was the business of opium dealers to have it sort of somehow smuggled into China's story, which, I mean, that part of the story, Professor Thampi knows much better, so I leave her to.
Yeah, that's remarkable. I mean, get someone else to do the last end of the dirty work, so to speak. Can you have the next slide, please? So we now begin talking about individuals, right? There are people on the Indian side, there are people on the Chinese side. Professor Thampi, tell us a bit about the Chinese traders. We want to know who these people are. What you see out here is a very famous painting of what is called Hokwa, a Chinese Hong merchant. Tell us this world of the Chinese trader, especially as they get into this opium trade.
All right, this Hokwa was at his time considered the richest man in the world. I mean, not just in China. He was considered the richest man in the world. Now, he is what was called a Hong merchant. The Chinese, let me just say one thing, a little bit in connection with what you were saying about why the East India Company didn't want to ship the opium itself. It's because the Chinese empire, the Qing empire, right from the early 18th century, was aware of the danger of opium and was aware of its deleterious effects, and imposed a ban on opium. Initially, they just imposed a ban on the trading in opium and consumption of opium within China, not on the traders. But 3 times they imposed the ban. I think 1730s first, then 1780s or 90s, then again in the mid-19th century. So because of that, the company didn't want to jeopardize its trade with China, and so they let the private traders. That's unfortunately where our Indian traders also have come into the picture. But coming back to Hokwa, so the Chinese, contrary to what the British later said, that the Qing Empire was antithetical to free trade and all that. Actually, the Qing Empire was greatly interested in trading with foreign nations because they got a revenue from it, and they needed the revenue. But they wanted to limit the interface between these, what could be troublesome foreign traders and their local population. And so they had a very efficient system known as the Hong merchants. These were licensed merchants. That is, they were licensed to trade with foreigners. So they were not only licensed to trade with foreigners, but they also took responsibility for the foreigners, for anything, for all their needs while they were in China. And they also, if anything went wrong, they were punished rather than the foreign traders. So this was actually a very open system of, it was open to trade with other countries, but they licensed. Now, Hokwa was probably one of the most successful of the Hong merchants. There were about, maybe at any given time, there would have been about 20 or 25 of them, but they frequently went bankrupt. At times the numbers came down to very few, at which point all the Western traders complained that, look, we don't have enough people to do business with. But one of the reasons was, for them getting bankrupt was because credit was difficult to get in China. Like the rate of interest was very, very high. And so a lot of these foreign traders did a side business of lending money to the Hong merchants, and they used to get the Hong merchants in their debt. And then when the merchants couldn't pay back, then they would default on their loans, and then. So anyway, it was a complex system, and Hokwa was probably the most successful of them. Now, he was like the main Chinese partner in China of Sir Jamsetji Jejeebhoy, who was the very well-known Indian trader from Bombay. Of course, Jamsetji Jejeebhoy also was very well connected with Jardine and Matheson, the British companies. But I would like to just mention one thing here is that the majority of Indian traders who went to China were small traders. They were not big traders like Jamsetji Jejeebhoy. And mostly they did not deal with the Hong merchants. So they dealt with the merchants. There was also a flourishing outside merchant system. In fact, they were called outside merchants or shopmen. They used to call them shopmen, who would also hover around. I think it's very much, you can imagine a bazaar in India, and then you would understand. There were the big guys, the seths, and then, there were these shopmen. So most Indian traders dealt with the outside shopmen, and that's how it worked.
And this Hong is the same root of Hong Kong, by any chance?
No. That's a different thing. It actually is the word Hang in Chinese, which means like a company or a bank, and it is part of the word for bank in China today. Yin Hang means bank. That Hang is, in Cantonese pronunciation, is Hong. So that's what.
Interesting.
Professor Thampi, since you mentioned these outside traders and they're hovering around and they're also important to opium smuggling, I think it might be useful just to say something about the geography of the Canton region, because that also facilitated this kind of.
And why Canton?
And how porous it made that.
Okay. Yes, actually Canton becomes so important because initially several ports were opened to trade with the foreigners, the maritime traders. But because they actually the facilities for dealing with the foreign traders were not so developed in some of the other ports, finally it sort of came down to Canton, which was a big established port. And so there was only one port open to maritime trade after about the middle of the 18th century. So, and this has had as I said, very interesting geography, because the waterfront was dominated by what were called factories. Now, factories were not really factories like these opium-producing factories. They were actually combined godowns and residences of the foreign traders. And the foreign traders were allowed to trade only during a season, the trading season. The monsoon winds used to bring the ships to that region, and then at the end of that season, which was about 3 months, so June to September was the trading season really, they would go back. They'd have to leave. Now, most of the Indian traders would go back to India. Those who had little more means would stay in Macau, which, if you know the geography of that region, Macau is very near Canton. And Macau was under Portuguese control. So, but whatever it was, they could not stay in Canton at the end of the trading season, though many of them illegally did. But they would go back. So that was why Canton became so important for the opium trade and all that.
Thanks for that. Yeah, can we have the next slide, please? Some figures to understand, what we're talking about. So we started off with understanding what is opium, and we said, there's a place called Patna, there's something called as Bengal opium, and this starts flowing down the Ganga. It's going all the way to China in the late 18th, early 19th century. But opium very soon becomes India, or let's say British India's leading export item, right? So it's in the 19th century, for most decades of the 19th century, over 30%, almost one-third of everything that went out of India was essentially a narcotic. To also place it into context today, India has a trade deficit with China of about $100 billion plus, which means we're a net importer from China today. But we were a net exporter to China in a massive way 200 years back, but of a narcotic, right? So this is how it's flipped over 200 years, the India-China kind of trade balance. But you'll see some other items which, who receded in importance. That's how big opium was, about a third of exports in the 19th century. Next slide, please. And these two lines just tell you a bit about the Bengal opium and Malwa opium. And over time, Malwa opium catches up. Now, what is Malwa? It's a region in Madhya Pradesh. It's in western India. And that is why we now come to Bombay. We've talked about Bengal and Calcutta, what we call as Bengal opium, but now we're shifting gears to another part of the world called Malwa opium. Next slide, please. And this is just a map. You might not be able to identify all the towns. The font size might be small, but it's basically a map of Western India, taken from Professor Farooqui's book, which basically points out smuggling routes in Western India. Right? So now this is not just Bombay. There's a series of towns interconnected in what is called as Malwa opium smuggling. So Professor Farooqui, take us through this world very briefly. What is happening? We understood that production was happening in, say, Patna and going to Calcutta. What's happening on this side of the world?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, apart from Eastern India, the other major producing zone was the Central Indian Plateau of Malwa. Most of it, the Malwa is in present the Madhya Pradesh, and this was a region which, unlike Eastern India, was not directly ruled by the British. This was entirely under princely rule. This entire area of Malwa, which was also a major opium producing zone, was entirely under princely rule. The two largest states were the Gwalior state, ruled by the Scindias, the Indore state. We just had a session on Indore, that historical fiction. So the Indore state, ruled by the Holkars, but then there were a number of other states as well in this region, Bhopal, and then there was a small part of Malwa spills over into neighboring Rajasthan, where Jhalawar and Kota were important opium producing areas. Now, there was a limited trade in the opium produce of this region in the pre-colonial period. What traders on the west coast, and that's where Bombay and that's where also the Portuguese and Macau comes in, is that these traders, they saw their great opportunity with the expansion of the opium market in China. So they thought that it might be a good idea to start selling opium, which was not controlled by the East India Company, in China, using their own traditional networks, which included, of course, the earlier sort of China trade networks, but also the Portuguese trading networks linking the West Coast with China and Southeast Asia. So they are beginning to source this opium, and this becomes a source of great trouble for the East India Company, because this is an opium, what came to be known as Malwa opium in the wholesale market, was an opium that was not controlled by the East India Company. It was sort of undermining the monopoly which the company wanted to establish. It is competing with the East India Company's opium in the China market. the East India Company first tries to ban this trade, but since they don't have much control over the coastline till almost till at least 1818, they are unable to do that. Then they try to buy up all this opium from these princely states and auction it at Bombay. They are not able to regulate this trade. That's where this smuggling networks is established. So Bombay traders and Malwa traders, they kind of come together to establish a long smuggling network to evade British control. And so routes from northern Malwa through Rajasthan, Pali, and then across the desert to Karachi. Incidentally, the rise of Karachi as a modern port is directly linked to opium smuggling out of Karachi. Karachi became the point from where then it was shipped along the coastline to Daman, which was a Portuguese enclave. And the Portuguese, in fact, encouraged these smugglers to bring the opium to Daman, where they levied a duty on it, so that then it could be shipped to Portuguese Macau. So their control of Daman on the west coast of India and of Macau in China enabled them to completely evade British control and send this opium into China. And so it's really two smuggling networks in operation. One on the west coast and the other in China, and the Portuguese provide the link till eventually the British realize that they are losing out on whatever share they can get from this trade. So in the 1830s, they then allow the opium to be shipped through Bombay, only shipped through Bombay. It couldn't be sold in Bombay, and levying a duty on the transit duty on this opium. So that makes Bombay a very, very important center of the trade for Malwa opium.
Thanks for that. Just remarkable set of towns that come into picture. And of course, one is my beautiful city of Bombay. So the next slide, please. Can we have the next slide? So this remarkable individual called Jamshedji Jijiboy. You've heard of the JJ School of Art and the JJ Hospital and a lot of JJs in Bombay and many places which are linked with this character. Professor Thampi, take us through the world of Indian traders. Maybe you want to speak a little bit about him. Or one of the hallmarks of both their works is to look at the lives, at the records of traders. So a question to both of you is, who are some of the interesting traders that you found in your research? Who would you like to tell us about? Let's start maybe with a bit on JJ and then a few more.
Okay, well, definitely Jamshedji Jijiboy made the biggest mark among the Parsi traders. But Parsis were not the only traders in opium. There was the community of the Baghdadi Jews, of whom the foremost representative was the Sassoon family. I think many of you would have heard of the Sassoons, of whom the first was David Sassoon, who really sort of established the Sassoon empire. But there are many Sassoon things also in Bombay. Sassoon Reading Room was where I did some of my research for the. So the Sassoons were there. There were also the Ismailis. They traded more towards the west, with towards the Red Sea, East Africa, but they also traded with China. So there were many, but I think what distinguished the Parsis is that they went themselves to China. That was not very much there among other Indian trading communities. They didn't have inhibitions about getting on those ships or and sailing to China themselves. So Jamshedji Jijiboy himself, when he was young and not yet established, made 5 trips to China in a row in almost 7 years or something like that. And before he made enough money that he could afford to come back, sit in Bombay, and then direct his whole trading empire from Bombay. He is interesting also for the reason he's the one source we have, which is not a British source or a European source. He left his pile of letter books of Jamshedji Jijiboy, which are there in the University of Bombay Library, and I don't know now whether it has gone to the National Archives, or I'm not very sure. It's still in microfilm of it there. But I remember seeing those, and it's quite a great feeling to look at his letter books. I mean, most of it is entirely, business, figures and things. But he used to write letters to his correspondents, which included Matheson, Jardine, also to Hokwa. He wrote letters to him. And those letters some of them are really interesting because they give a sense. Otherwise, it's very hard to get a sense of what were the Indian traders thinking or feeling. Like, what did they feel about this trade? So, anyway, I don't want to, if there are questions, I can talk about that. But, so that way, Jamsetji Jijiboy is interesting. But I would like to say that what I find the most interesting is the number of ordinary Parsi traders who went and stayed in Canton for years. And the reason I know about it is that there was this historian in Hong Kong called the Reverend Carl T. Smith. Very interesting person. He spent decades in Hong Kong. He spent about 40 years in the archives in Hong Kong and Macau, taking down just the names and the dates and the places of all the foreign traders. So not just the foreign traders, but this is one of the things he did. So he documented, the names. And actually, at the end of my book, I used his notes to compile a long list. So before that, when I started doing this work, they were really anonymous, I felt. The Indian traders. You'd hear maybe of Jamsetji Jijiboy, but they were really like faceless and anonymous. And, Carl Smith really has given a name to them. And not only that, the years they were there, plus which factory, I talked about the factories in Canton, which factory they lived in. So from that, you get some sense of who they were. They were in all male, of course. No women were allowed. Foreign women were allowed in Canton. So these people, I feel, is really interesting. Somebody wants to do some more research, they could follow up those names and, back to Bombay. Yeah.
Professor Thampi, there's something I just wanted to ask you, since you mentioned this very large number of Indians in Canton. It would have been difficult for them to find a place to stay there because there was no sort of separate factory for Indians. These are all European or the American factory.
Yeah, that's true. There was no Indian factory. I mean, the factories were owned in some sense, or leased, you could say, leased, not owned, by different foreign countries. So there was the British factory, the Dutch factory, there was even the Norwegian factory, US, American factory, so on and so forth. So there was no separate Indian factory, but Indians could lease rooms within these other factories, which they did. But there were also some factories which were not having the foreign flag on them. And in fact, the Chinese gave it a name, they call it miscellaneous factory, or the Chow Chow, as they call it, Chow Chow factory. And Chow Chow factories was full of Indians and also other nationalities which didn't. So they were able to rent on a small scale. And these same people are the ones who dealt with the shopmen, which I was telling you. So just behind the factories, there was this narrow lanes, like a grid, full of shops. And it was like teeming with business. This was not part of the Chinese city of Canton. This was still considered part of the, foreign area of residence. But, so you can you imagine, all these teeming with, Indians. And actually, the Indian traders were more than British traders there at a certain stage. This is something we don't really know about, but it is a fact.
And Professor Farooqui, some traders that come to your mind who while you were researching, especially the Goa-Bombay connections, maybe?
Yeah. Before I come to that, quickly just let me mention that along with the Jamshedji Gigi Boy letter books, the Jardine Matheson correspondence is also available. And it's interesting that many of these people who are figure in the Jamshedji Gigi Boy letter books, they, you can see the other side of the correspondence in the Jardine Matheson, because usually archivists are left with only one side of a set of letters. But here you can actually, with the Jardine Matheson archive, often also see the other sort of the other end of this correspondence. And talking about traders, actually one of the sort of on the west coast, the leading trader and Jamshedji Jiwa actually started his career as a clerk in the establishment of this Indian Portuguese trader, Rogério de Faria, who from the late 18th century onwards is using his networks along the west coast. He was initially based in Goa. He gradually shifted to Bombay, to Daman, and he used his wide network to smuggle opium from the opium coming from Malwa along the west coast to Macau. So that network became important, and people like Jamshedji Jijiboy actually were able to learn this trade, the tricks of this trade in the Faria's establishment. But then, as you rightly pointed out, that in the India end, it's not just Parsis, but then there are a number of other groups also. There are the Marwaris, there are Banyas from Gujarat. There are other groups also, Konkani Muslims, who are also actively engaged in this trade. Jagannath Shankar Seth, then there is Muhammad Ali Roge. So these are other big names in this trade apart from Jamshedji Jijiboy, the sort of Bombay end of this.
Yeah, you mentioned Jardine Matheson. Can you have the next slide, please? We have a picture of Jardine Matheson. So this is Jamshedji JJ on the left, and Jardine and Matheson on the right. And just to again give you some contemporary context, the legacy of JJ in the world of business maybe not really out there today, but Jardine Matheson continues to be one of the biggest business groups of Hong Kong. In real estate today, but essentially a trading firm for almost 200 years now. And what's really interesting about this collaboration is that they actually met accidentally on a ship. So, the trading kind of a connection start there. Literally, there's a skirmish in the Indian Ocean. There's a kind of change of guard on the ship, and they're literally, prisoners on the ship. And that's where they strike up a friendship, and that's how, these two big business houses kind of forge a connection. Can you have the next slide, please? They mentioned the Sassoons. David Sassoon, the family of the Sassoons, very, very powerful in the world of opium. Also, very powerful in Hong Kong. And after opium, went into cotton textiles in a big way. Yeah, next slide, please. To give you a sense of, the Bombay-Hong Kong connections, you have the Sassoon Library where she worked, on her book. But Hong Kong itself has, Sassoon Road and so on. So Bombay and Hong Kong's connections are, remarkable, very closely connected in the 19th century, precisely because of opium. Next slide, please. So there's a person called Kowasji Jahangir, Ready Money, and the surname is very interesting, Ready Money. And so I'm going to ask Professor Madhavi Thampi to tell us a bit about who are these Ready Monies and what's happening out here.
Well, actually, the Ready Money name is important because the first person who's known to have sailed, first Indian known to have sailed Parsi to China is a precursor of this Ready Money called Hirji Jivanji Ready Money. And he sailed, I think, in 1756 and went to China. I believe, I've heard this, that the name Ready Money is because they were very ready. They were ready with cash. Anyone who needed the cash, they could lend it. And so the name Ready Money came like that. But it's, I mean, he may have been the first one to have sailed. We don't know. But we know from records of, let's say, 1720s and 30s, so that is good 20, 30 years earlier, that already Hong merchants were indebted to Parsi moneylenders. Now, this is also it's a gray area. I mean, somebody has written on it, Anthony Chen, but who were these Parsis who Hong merchants in China would have been indebted to? So we don't know if these Parsis were in Canton or, there were trading links with Southeast Asia. So even the Hong merchants used to, so these could have been Parsi traders who were in Southeast Asia, like Java, that area. But it's interesting because that means even before ready money, there would have been other contacts between Parsis and these Hong merchants.
Yeah, really remarkable. And you still, if you go to South Bombay, you'll find the ready money mansion and, variety of things. And of course, in contemporary business history, they're the moneyed reddys, which is a very different phenomenon in Andhra Pradesh. Next slide, please. I was in Hong Kong, a few months back, and when I entered the University of Hong Kong, the first statue that greeted me was a Parsi gentleman, Sir H.N. Modi. He gave the money to, set up the University of Hong Kong, which is one of the top-ranked universities of the world. How did he start his life? As an opium auctioneer, in Hong Kong when he went there. End of the slide deck, so you can put the session creative back again. We've talked about various aspects of the opium trade from a very kind of a-normative position. So the critique of the opium trade, so in that time, were there people who said this is wrong? And did you find such, folks or how did people justify this trade? Did people in Malwa know that the end product was these opium dens in China? Or did they think that they were making a medicine? How did people themselves perceive the production and trade of this? Question to both of you. Yeah.
So, yes, this is an important question because, as we know, the opium trade itself was internationally criminalized by the beginning of the 20th century, and the League of Nations, actually under the auspices of the League of Nations, there was a series of international treaties which committed countries to sort of take measures to stop this trade. But that process, which began in the last quarter of the 19th century, of opposing the opium trade, met with very stiff resistance. To critique opium was not an easy thing. I mean, nobody had any sort of illusions about this, that this was being sent for medicinal purposes. That was sent as a narcotic, but then the entire and Professor Thampi would sort of know this much better, that, the entire stereotype of the Chinese was also, had a role to play in justifying that, well, the Chinese, don't really bother about this, so it's not our concern, really. Now, for Indians, this was just any commodity. It was very difficult to, it's actually very difficult to find people who were critical of the trade itself. There are two names which I do want to mention. Of course, one a very well-known name, Dadabhai Nauroji. So Dadabhai Nauroji is a very fierce critic. And in fact, it's somewhat surprising that among sort of the early nationalists, he's one, and nationalist ideologues, he's perhaps unique in his condemnation of the opium trade. But there are other names also who have begun to figure in histories of the anti-opium crusade. So there's another person, a woman by the name of Sundarbai Pawar, and recently we have a book by Stephen Rimner, which has sort of traced her career and her campaign and the pamphlets that she wrote against the opium trade, her connections with missionaries. And here I would then like to bring in just quickly, I'll just spend 2 or 3 minutes just quickly to talk about this, that because, this transition from being a legal commodity to internationally being criminalized is something that happened in these 2 or 3 decades. So the anti-opium lobby actually with its international connections, became very powerful. And there's a very powerful critique in China also of this trade. And that compelled the British government, that's the government in London, to set up a Royal Commission on Opium in 1893. The Royal Commission on Opium produced an enormous amount of material in the 7 volumes of its evidence. 7 massive volumes of evidence. These are testimonies taken in India. At the end of that, all those testimonies, this is a classic case of how inquiry commissions are used to subvert, a particular kind of, so there's this campaign for outlawing opium. The Opium Commission is set up. It goes touring India, collects a huge amount of evidence, and its report eventually says, well, no evidence is available to suggest that that opium is a harmful substance. It might even be in circumstances it has its medicinal uses. In fact, the one argument there was that, well, alcohol abuse is more serious than opium abuse, and so this is not a problem. If there are some Chinese who are not taking it in moderation, well, that is a problem for China. But the bigger argument was it is going to have a serious impact on the revenues of the Indian government, and the consequences of that are going to be worse in terms of, people will, welfare schemes won't be there and so on. So that was subverted, but the international pressure ultimately was so much that eventually, one can't go into the history of that, but that international pressure eventually resulted in Britain agreeing in 1912 to signing the Opium Convention, and that sort of began the process of criminalizing opium. Of course, other narcotic substances.
Yeah, and you've given a very good picture of, the story in India. Professor Thampi, what is happening in China in the 19th century? Of course, we have the famous or infamous opium wars and so on. How was this seen in Chinese history in the 19th century? And also, how is it seen today, when people look back at this particular time period? Maybe start with the 19th century, and what is the angst? Because, of course, a large part of the population is addicted to it. So there is a section of population which wants it. So who's opposing in China? How does it really end?
Well, the speed at which opium is unlike unlike many other it was just another commodity, as you said. By the way, I haven't seen anything said by any Indian trader involved in that which shows any remorse about it. But it was very well known. And opium is a commodity that creates its own expanding market. The addiction spreads. So really, they didn't have to do much. Once they had got the, pathways for opium to enter, it just spread. And, it got to the point where in the 1830s, the emperor did something which was sort of done only in a few times in Chinese history, which is what's called the Great Opium Debate. That is, he opened the thing of what to do about this problem to all the officials, not just the officials in his court or his, his council and all that, but to the entire bureaucracy, asking what should we do. That shows that it was seen as a very major problem. Both for many reasons. The addiction, the effect it had on people. It had also spread to the military forces. So it had really had a terrible impact on the soldiers and others. And of course, money, silver bullion was going out of China. It was the reverse of what was happening earlier in huge quantities, which affected the whole economy, and exchange rate between copper, silver, and so on. So there was this great opium debate, and at the end of it, they thought of various alternatives, including whether to legalize it, to somehow control it. But they decided to suppress it. And once they decided to suppress it, they sent an imperial commissioner, Lin Zexu, to Guangzhou with powers to suppress the trade. And that's what really triggered off the Opium War, because he confiscated the opium. Interestingly, out of about 20,000 chests of opium they were confiscated from the British traders, about 8,000 or 9,000 belonged to Indian traders, okay? Of which maybe about 5,000 belonged to a single Indian trader called Dadabhai Rastamji. We haven't talked about him much, but he was there. So, when they tried to suppress it, that's when, all the war noises started, and then the war came out. So for China, what they call today that their century of humiliation begins with the Opium War. So what they call from 1840s to 1940s, that's what is referred to as the century of humiliation, begins with that. But the interesting thing I feel is, like, from what I've seen of Chinese documents of the period, I mean, they know very well that, the opium is coming from India, but the blame is put more on the British. I mean, they have already that understanding or the feeling that India is a colony or is subjugated by the British. And so though they're, really look at it, they have more blame for the British. But just I wanted, in this connection, one interesting thing that when they started to impose strictures on the foreign trading community in Canton, just before the Opium War, Indian traders sent a memorial to the emperor, forwarded by the leading Hong merchants there, and then the governor general, Chinese governor general, to the emperor, saying that, we are not British, we are Indians, and, we shouldn't be penalized for this. And this went all the way up to the emperor there at that time, and that document is there, the memorial, and in the emperor's writing, it's written on this. So please excuse us from the, it says, but that is where the opium comes from, So he knew that, and so they were aware of it. So this is the way it was.
Very, very interesting. Professor Farooqui, just a quick minute on the popular culture of opium trade today. So the historical trade today, and particular phrase called "Chandu Khana ki baat hai."
Yeah. In terms of popular culture, actually I haven't seen opium figure much in cinema in particular, but I think it is Amitav Ghosh's trilogy which really focused attention on opium and the enormous damage that opium had done. I mean, he even in his second novel, River of Smoke, also sort of draws attention to, you refer to this destruction of opium, the ecological consequences of dumping 20,000 chests of opium into the Pearl River. So, and his critique has been, I mean, he has been a very, very powerful, I mean, these three novels are a very, very powerful condemnation of what opium has meant to to China, to India, and in his latest non-fiction book, Smoke and Ashes, he actually shows that for the West also is paying the price for this opium, the huge amount of opium that was unleashed globally has its consequences. Incidentally, the American Civil War was at the time when this opium addiction became a serious, very serious problem. Morphine used for it was a very sort of very violent, very brutal war, and morphine was used very extensively during the war for soldiers, and this led to opium addiction, for which eventually the cure was heroin. Heroin initially was an over-the-counter drug, and because this was meant to combat opium addiction till it was discovered that heroin is an even bigger problem as an addiction. So the way these have, and of course, those are the, drugs have figured more in those societies which now have this as a big problem. And of course, you mentioned Urta, Punjab, which, I mean, these are problems which we continue to face as well.
Yeah, very interesting. No heroes clearly in the opium trade, but as you mentioned, there's a heroine in this context. Let's open it out to questions. Quick round of questions. Let's have the mics passed around. I see a hand there at the back, one hand here in the front, two on this side here. Quick questions and quick responses.
Yeah. Very interesting. Thank you, both professors. I enjoyed it. I have two questions. One is, I never hear, I don't know much, I have to say that. I never hear anything about the work part. The workers who were involved in growing this. Was it like slavery? Was it feudalism? You have the East India Company and you have the princes on the other side. So what were their conditions like? Did anything filter down to them? That's one. What's the connection between opium and Shanghai? We've known it in English literature as den of notoriety, nefariousness. In fact, you have the word Shanghaied. So what was the link in that? Thank you.
Maybe Professor Thampi first on the opium and Shanghai link.
Well, once the Opium War ended, it ended in a treaty which opened up 5 ports to foreign trade. And one of these was Shanghai. So Shanghai at that time was not such a big, it was just a small port, like they would say fishing village. But, just like all those treaty ports, they were called, they were connected with opium. In fact, I would say, the Sassoons actually became the biggest Indian traders of opium, right up till the time when the biggest Indian exporters of opium to China, right till the early 20th century, when finally that trade ended. So the Sassoons were very dominant in Shanghai. I mean, they controlled a lot of real estate, banking, and other things. So I think, all the treaty ports and, were associated with opium, but maybe because of the Sassoons' presence and, and Shanghai rapidly became a kind of bigger port than Canton, and Shanghai and Hong Kong became the 2 main ports. Mm.
Yeah, I should also mention there's a new book out called Madmen in Shanghai, which is on the advertising history of Shanghai, and it has some references to this. But yeah.
Yeah. Actually, we didn't get time to talk about the production process and labor because we are focusing on the trade in opium. But very quickly, opium was produced by small peasants. So both in Malwa as well as in Gangetic, Eastern India, is produced by small peasants. In the case of the East India Company, when they say that the peasants are free to cultivate or not cultivate, it doesn't actually work that way. The coercive apparatus of the colonial state was used to compel peasants to take these opium licenses in those areas which were sort of where the soil was appropriate, for instance, Saran district in Bihar. So the coercive element is there, and it's coercive in various ways because they don't get remunerative prices when they take it to the depots where they have to then sell it to give it to the hand it over to the company. So it works at various levels, but the element of coercion, the coercion of the bureaucratic, the apparatus of the colonial state remained very, very important. This also operates in a similar way, but not exactly in the same way in the princely states, because peasants are not interested in growing this opium precisely because it's backbreaking work, and what they receive from local village level merchants who then take up opium and then process it enmeshes them in sort of debt, and that creates its own problems. So for them also it's unremunerative. But the element again of compulsion, because we do have evidence of peasants growing other crops which are forcefully uprooted so that they are compelled to plant opium on their land, and it takes up the most fertile, those portions which are very well irrigated when they sow their soil with opium, with poppy.
Yeah, wonderful. And I should mention, there are two books are really the outstanding works on the opium trade. He mentioned the Amitav Ghosh in the world of historical fiction. And Rolf Bauer in 2019 has a book on exactly this question. It's a book called Opium and Peasant Production. So it's a whole book on the actual work practices and so on. There's a question here. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a slight tangent to the the India-China trade part of it. But I was curious to know about the indigenous usage of opium, of the narcotic, before the trade began. I mean, you did mention that there was an element of coercion in growing the crops, but there must have been some level of, so one for instance heard that Mangal Pandey was an opium addict. Before that we've heard that Emperor Jahangir was pretty much spent most of his reign in a stupor, in an opium stupor and so on. So was there really a lot of indigenous usage of opium?
Yeah, let me rephrase that question. Why did the Chinese get addicted so much more than the Indians? This particular time.
One simple answer to that question is that the opium that was produced by the company was not intended for consumption in India at all. Whatever was of inferior quality was reserved for the Indian market and sold as abkari opium. Till very recently, there were licensed opium shops. Even in Delhi, in Jhandewala, there used to be a shop.
The Islamic prohibition of sharab haram nahi thi, magar prohibited thi. So whether it's Emperor Jahangir or Emperor Akbar could be high on afim, kosher, वो नशा kosher था. But I'm more interested in राजस्थान वाला जो इलाका है.
जी मैं उस पर जरा सा मैं उनके
सवाल
जी
वो आपको याद होगा वो जसवंत सिंह जी का वो जब एक्चुअली में गुलाब जल पिला रहे थे अफीम पिला रहे थे तो वो नुस्खा वहाँ भी था और वो अब हम कहते हैं कि अफीम का नाम से अहीफेन है ना कि सांप का जो फ्रॉथ है that's supposed to be the अफीम but what I'm wondering is that whether indigenous consumption जो आपने कहा inferior quality थी मगर था वो addiction क्यों नहीं हुआ उसके reasons बड़े interesting होने चाहिए.
So two questions. Yeah.
Instead of taking your question and what Professor Pant has to say, see, opium production is well documented for the pre-colonial period. The Aine-Akbari lists poppy and opium as it's produced in its list of crops for the Malwa region. So opium is well established. We also know from various other sources that opium consumption is also, that's also well documented, including particularly opium for medicinal purposes. So as a kind of household remedy is something that was fairly well known, well established in parts of at least the documentation that I'm aware of, Central India, parts of Western India. Also, some of its traditional usage, as for instance in Rajasthan that you mentioned, where the method of consumption, if it's ingesting it, is actually very different from what it became in China, which was opium smoking. So it's dissolving in water and then sort of having a few drops of it as it is passed around. That itself acted as a kind of social control. So the social control is, and mechanisms of social control do exist. They ritualize it. They sort of limit the amount of consumption and specify the occasions on which it is to be used. There, of course, it's for narcotic purposes, but then it's ritualized and therefore there's a social control. But the large, sort of more large-scale consumption is now, it's not just Jahangir, but we have evidence of some of the very high-ranking nobles. Inayat Khan, very well-known noble, who's Goswami Sahib ke wo paintings pe jo kitab hai, usme there's that this noble, he's sort of as an opium addict in the last stage of his life, and it's really sort of pathetic to look at his condition. So obviously this opium is there, but I really don't have an answer to this question, whether it is the prohibition in Islam and therefore opium is a substitute which became
So I would like to say, does it have something to do with the Chinese connection and the Chinese colonies in Tengda, which are primarily from Canton? तो उनसे वो लत लगी हिंदुस्तानियों को चंडू खाने वाली
चंडू खाने वाली बात बल्कि इन्होंने भी कही थी. Actually, चंडू खाना is something very specific. You see, chandu is opium smoking, and in fact there was a great stigma attached to opium smoking in the Indian context. It was sort of something that somebody who's beyond redemption would actually go and smoke opium. So smoking of opium is really something that, so China, it's opium smoking. In fact, in Southeast Asia, it's opium smoking with tobacco, both of which the Dutch actually brought. Both these came together, really, these two addictions, tobacco and opium. So opium with the tobacco was something that in Southeast Asia, opium smoking in China, but in India, having chandu is opium smoking, that was really looked down upon. So I think that is something which there was no sort of glamour really attached to this addiction with the smoking, which might have been one of the reasons why it was able to. But I should also add that the British actually exercised considerable control over opium consumption in India.
Okay, one last question.
Good evening, sir. Good evening, ma'am. I've studied architecture at University of Manchester, and it was during that time, during history of architecture lessons, I was informed about how rich the cotton traders in Manchester were through cotton trading. And at a point, they were richer. The cotton traders in Manchester were richer than the Queen herself. So direct implications of this was the indigo and the cotton cash crops being grown here in India forcefully by the farmers led to the great famines. So I wanted to know, I'm sure that opium too might have contributed to the man-made famines and the poverty and the hunger in that part of the country. So if you could just shed a bit of light on.
No, the connection with famines is something, that directly might be difficult, but there is another connection. You mentioned Manchester and cotton, and I think, that's a very important connection. So here, Indian opium was being sent to China to buy tea from China for the British market. So it's tea for Britain. In Britain, the tea consumption really became it became a working class beverage in the latter half of the 18th and early 19th century, when it's sort of mass consumption of tea is something that becomes very widespread. And tea with sugar, so it has to be tea and sugar. So it's not just tea, it's sugar. So it's empty calories which are cheaply available. This sugar comes from the West Indies, which in turn is grown by slave labor. And the slaves, of course, come across the Atlantic. There's the flourishing slave trade. And this working class that we are talking of is the Manchester textile worker that we are talking of. So it's, colonialism really has these international networks which link the slave trade, sugar, tea, and opium, and of course cotton as well, which, so opium really plays that part in this international kind of colonial commodity exchange.
And my short response is, in the late 19th century, where the biggest famines happened, by then opium was a very small part of total production. Last question to Professor Thampi, and then we'll close the session. And this is about my city, Bombay. As I started out by saying, we have two Delhi University people talking about Bombay. Is it true that, opium made Bombay? Because that's the basic premise of both of your books. Is it true in terms of even the philanthropy of those industrialists, like we saw, JJ and so on? The architecture, since we have an architecture student, the architecture of many of the mansions and the royal places in Bombay, would you really say that opium has been central to the making of Bombay?
Actually, you are the person to answer that.
Your book is titled China and the Making of Bombay.
Bombay, yeah. But, yes, I called it China and the Making of Bombay, and I took a little longer view. So I talked about the cotton trade, the raw cotton trade, opium, and then cotton yarn. In India's earliest textile, industrial product, one of the earliest to really take off was cotton yarn, and that went to China too. So I took a sort of longer view, of which opium is, of course, very important and very central. But starting from, let's say, 1780s to about 1910, when cotton yarn got eclipsed by Japanese cotton yarn coming in. So if you take this whole period, definitely, it is the whole period when, India exported these three products to China in vast quantities. It was definitely the period of the rise of Bombay and, it coming to like a preeminence among India. Otherwise, before that, Bombay was, compared to Calcutta, was much smaller, more backward. So, yes, but, specifically opium, I think you can maybe talk.
Professor Thampi, in your book, you tell us about, I found that very fascinating of this, the porcelain in Parsi houses, which comes on the return journey from China. When these ships go out, they need ballast, so they bring back. So, in fact, there's a very nice photograph that you have in your book of these big porcelain Chinese vases.
Yeah.
And also you talk about the designs, the silk designs which underwent change, those festive saris for weddings. And
this is the irony of it, a trade which was based largely on a drug like opium. But, if you look at, the influence of artistic or cultural influences on from China into Bombay, it came through this trade, but in the reverse direction. As you mentioned, one of the reasons why Parsi traders brought large quantities of porcelain vases, huge ones, some of them, you may have seen them, is because they didn't have much to bring back with them from after they had unloaded their opium and other things back to India. So porcelain was a heavy item. It could act as ballast in the holds of the ships. It wouldn't get spoiled. Water could come on it. So, this was one of the, items that came back, as well as the same Parsi traders who lived in those factory areas and dealt with the shopmen. That same area of Canton was teeming with about 5,000 shops producing export art. You may have heard of this Chinese export art, which we know went in huge quantities to the US, England, and gave rise to this thing called chinoiserie, this fascination with things Chinese. But actually, they also, produced for the Indian market. And they were brought back by Bombay traders back to Bombay. And two products which are really a product of this China connection. One is if you know, Parsi sari called the Gara saris with that silk embroidery on silk, on heavy satin actually. That is directly, it was initially made in China for Parsis, and later, of course, it was made in, but using that Chinese silk embroidery technique and even Chinese motifs in that. That is one, the Gara sari, and then this type of silk weaving called Tanchoi silk weaving. You may have heard of it and you may associate it with Varanasi, but actually it was a type of weaving which was brought back from China to Surat. Actually, they say Jamsetji Jiji Boy played a role in that. There's no confirmation of that. But, and set up this kind of weaving, which later was transferred to Varanasi, where the master weavers there, produced it. So, I mean, these are the kind of, interesting sideshow, if you like, of the opium trade.
Thank you so much. I think it's been an absolutely wonderful session where we've kind of traversed the opium world over the last 100 years. So I'd like to thank the Delhi University professors for educating this Bombaykar and others as well. In fact, I was in China a few months back, and for the first time in my life, they said, "Oh, Chinmay, it's a perfect anagram of my China." So there is a Bombay connection with China, I think, embedded in certain names. In the world of business and economic history, of course, the opium trade is still very important. The narcotics trade in various forms is still alive in different parts of the world. And also what's interesting is that India is now considered to be the pharmacy of the world. We export a lot of medicines around the world. So from exporting narcotics in the 19th century to the pharmacy of the world is a remarkable transformation in India's image as well in the outside world. So thank you once again for this wonderful session. And please look up their books. Some of them are in the bookstalls in the ground floor. Over to you, Disha.
Thank you so much. And it was such an interesting talk. Got to learn so much about India-China links. And as you've said, Professor Thampi, it's now bilateral. There's so many facets to it. So thank you once again. And before we wrap up, I would like to request Professor Rakesh Pasand to please present our speakers with the mementos.